If I told you that South Korea, one of the most modern and digitally connected nations on Earth, was once a country where a woman could be jailed for wearing a skirt above her knee, would you believe it? Between 1948 and 2026, South Korea's attitudes towards sex, marriage, and the human body went through one of the most dramatic transformations in modern history. From strict Confucian family codes to K-pop idols shaping global beauty standards, from state-run brothels near military bases to a booming feminist movement that shook the nation's courts, this is a story that most textbooks never fully tell. And by the end of this video, we will reveal the single event that historians say permanently changed how an entire generation of Koreans think about love, consent, and identity. Video promise. In this video, we are going to explore the strict Confucian roots that shaped Korean sexuality for centuries, how the Korean War and its aftermath reshaped intimacy, marriage, and survival, the hidden history of state-regulated sex work near American military bases, the censorship laws that once banned kissing scenes on national television, the rise of the feminist and Me Too movements that rocked Korean society, and the shocking modern development that changed everything for younger generations. Stay with us, because the final reveal connects all of these threads into one surprising conclusion, and it explains why so much of this history was left out of official education for so long. We will also look closely at how ordinary people, not just kings and lawmakers, experience these changes in their everyday lives, because the real history of a nation's sexuality is written far more in personal diaries, court testimonies, and quiet acts of resistance than in any single law or headline. To understand South Korean sexuality after 1948, we first need to understand the centuries-old foundation it was built on. For over 500 years, the Joseon dynasty enforced a strict Confucian moral code that placed enormous value on family hierarchy, chastity, and male authority. Women were expected to remain virgins until marriage, and their entire social worth was often tied to their reproductive role within the household. Premarital relationships were heavily stigmatized, arranged marriages were the norm, and public displays of affection were almost unthinkable. When the Republic of Korea was formally established in 1948, these Confucian values did not disappear. Instead, they were absorbed into the new nation's legal and social systems. Marriage was viewed less as a romantic partnership and more as a duty to continue the family line. Divorce carried deep shame, particularly for women, and sex outside marriage could result in social exile from one's own community. Even discussing sexuality openly was considered improper, and most young Koreans learned about intimacy only through whispered rumors rather than formal education. What is surprising to many modern viewers is just how strictly this was enforced. Local community leaders and even police sometimes intervened in matters of personal relationships, treating what we would now consider private matters as issues of public morality. Village elders often held informal authority over young couples, and a woman suspected of impropriety could see her entire family's reputation damaged for a generation. Genealogical records, known as jokbo, were meticulously maintained by clans specifically to track legitimate lineage, and any perceived break in that lineage carried consequences far beyond the individuals involved. Education about the body and intimacy was almost non-existent in any formal sense. Sons were taught about duty and inheritance, while daughters were taught about obedience, modesty, and eventual marriage into another family's household, often losing much of their own family identity in the process. This system placed enormous psychological weight on women in particular, since their perceived virtue was treated as a direct reflection of their entire family's honor rather than a private, personal matter. This rigid framework would soon collide head-on with war, poverty, and foreign military presence, creating a very different and far more complicated chapter in Korean history. But this was only the beginning. What happened next, during and after the Korean War, would push Korean society into territory that historians still debate today. The Korean War, which broke out in 1950, devastated the peninsula and left millions displaced, widowed, or orphaned. In the chaos of survival, traditional Confucian expectations often gave way to desperate economic realities. Many women, having lost husbands, fathers, or entire families, found themselves with few options for financial survival in a shattered economy. It was during this period that the South Korean government, working alongside the United States military, established a system of regulated sex work near military bases, often referred to using the euphemism camp towns. These camp town districts became a significant, if rarely discussed, part of the post-war economy. Historical records show that the government registered and medically monitored many of these workers, treating the system less as a moral issue and more as a matter of public health and diplomatic convenience. This arrangement created a painful contradiction at the heart of Korean society. Publicly, the nation upheld strict Confucian values around chastity and family honor. Privately, the state was directly involved in facilitating an entire economy built around sex work, largely justified as necessary for maintaining the alliance with the United States. Women who worked in these camp towns were frequently stigmatized by the very society whose economic and political interests they were serving, often left without support once the system that used them moved on. Political marriages and family arrangements during this era were also shaped heavily by survival rather than romance. Families sought unions that offered stability, land, or protection rather than emotional compatibility. Matchmakers, both formal and informal, played an outsized role in post-war Korean society, often evaluating potential spouses based on family reputation, economic prospects, and physical health, rather than personal compatibility or affection. Scandals occasionally emerged, particularly when powerful officials were linked to the camp town system or to extramarital relationships. But these stories were usually buried quickly to protect the reputations of those involved. Meanwhile, ordinary citizens faced an entirely different reality. Many young widows, having lost husbands in the war, were pressured to remarry quickly for economic survival. Yet remarriage itself carried lingering social stigma in a culture that idealized lifelong loyalty to a single spouse, even after death. Orphaned children, of which there were hundreds of thousands after the war, were sometimes the product of relationships between Korean women and foreign soldiers. And these mixed-race children faced particularly severe discrimination throughout their lives, a painful and often overlooked dimension of this era's legacy. And the most shocking part of this history is still ahead, because the way this system was eventually confronted decades later would spark one of the most significant legal reckonings in modern Korean history. Popular culture today often paints a simplified picture of Korea's sexual history, either portraying it as universally conservative or, more recently, as suddenly and effortlessly liberal thanks to global pop culture influence. Neither picture is accurate. One common myth is that Korean society was uniformly repressive with no exceptions until Western influence arrived. In reality, historical records, including court documents and personal diaries from the early 20th century, reveal that premarital and extramarital relationships existed even under strict Confucian rule. They were simply hidden more effectively and punished more harshly when discovered. Another myth suggests that Korea's modern openness around sexuality is purely a recent imported phenomenon. Yet archaeological and historical research shows that pre-Confucian Korean societies, particularly during earlier dynastic periods, had markedly different and sometimes more flexible attitudes toward relationships and gender roles. The extreme conservatism most people associate with traditional Korea was largely a product of centuries of Confucian state policy, not an unbroken cultural default stretching back to ancient times. Court records from the 20th century also reveal something unexpected. Legal cases involving adultery, which remained a criminal offense in South Korea until as recently as 2015, show that enforcement was inconsistent and often used as a tool of social or political control rather than uniform moral policing. Wealthy or powerful individuals frequently avoided serious consequences, while ordinary citizens, especially women, bore the harshest penalties. This gap between the official narrative and the documented reality is one of the most important things to understand about this history. But the truth becomes even clearer once we compare South Korea directly to other major civilizations. When we place South Korea's 20th century sexual history alongside other major civilizations, striking contrasts emerge. Ancient Rome maintained a relatively open, if deeply unequal, attitude toward sexuality, with different rules for citizens, slaves, and women, but with far less state-run moral policing than post-war Korea would later develop. Ancient Egypt, similarly, held views on marriage and intimacy that were often practical and dynastic, particularly among royalty, without the intense communal shame that characterized Confucian Korea. Ancient Greece is well known for its complex and sometimes surprising social customs around relationships, particularly among elite classes, which stood in sharp contrast to the rigid family honor system of the Joseon dynasty. India's history reveals an equally layered picture, with religious texts sometimes celebrating sensuality and intimacy as sacred, existing alongside strict social codes that varied enormously by region, caste, and era. China, Korea's closest cultural and philosophical neighbor, shared many Confucian principles, but developed its own distinct legal and social approach to marriage, concubinage, and sexuality, particularly during dynastic periods, before undergoing its own dramatic 20th century transformation under different political pressures. Japan, Korea's colonial ruler from 1910 to 1945, also left a lasting imprint on Korean sexual history, both through the imposition of certain legal codes and through the deeply traumatic system of wartime sexual slavery inflicted on Korean women, an issue that continues to shape diplomatic relations between the two countries even today. Unlike the post-war camp town system, which involved the Korean government's own later complicity, the colonial-era system was imposed entirely by an occupying foreign power, and both legacies together left Korean society with an unusually complicated and painful relationship to the intersection of sexuality, state power, and national identity. What makes South Korea's case so distinctive is the speed and intensity of its transformation. A nation moving from strict, state-reinforced Confucian control to one of the most digitally influential and globally visible modern cultures in a matter of decades. Few other societies in the comparative historical record have compressed such a dramatic shift in sexual and social norms into so short a time frame. And this compression is precisely what makes South Korea such a compelling case study for historians of sexuality worldwide. Among all of these civilizations, one particular Korean legal practice remained so strict for so long that even historians studying comparative law find it difficult to believe it persisted into the 21st century. For much of South Korea's modern history, the law itself was one of the primary enforcers of sexual morality. Adultery was a criminal offense punishable by imprisonment from 1953 all the way until August 2015. When the Constitutional Court finally struck down the law as unconstitutional, ruling that it violated individuals' right to privacy and self-determination. Censorship laws also played a defining role. Korean television and film faced strict government oversight for decades, with kissing scenes, suggestive dialogue, and depictions of premarital relationships routinely cut or banned outright under military-influenced governments through the 1970s and 1980s. Public decency laws extended into everyday life as well, with authorities historically monitoring skirt lengths, hairstyles, and public affection under the justification of maintaining social order. Social expectations enforced additional invisible boundaries. Unmarried women who became pregnant faced severe social exile, often forced to give up children for adoption due to overwhelming stigma. LGBTQ individuals faced even harsher realities, with same-sex relationships remaining socially taboo and legally unrecognized for the vast majority of this period, forcing many people to live entirely hidden lives. Punishments were not always formal legal consequences. Informal social punishment, including community shaming, family disownment, and professional exclusion, often proved just as powerful as any written law, reinforcing conformity through fear of permanent social isolation. Employers sometimes dismissed workers over rumors alone, and schools occasionally expelled students suspected of romantic involvement, treating personal relationships as a threat to institutional reputation rather than a normal part of adolescent life. Even the adultery law itself, once studied closely, reveals a system that disproportionately targeted women. Legal historians examining constitutional court records note that the majority of criminal complaints under the statute were filed by husbands against wives or against the other man involved, while similar complaints against husbands were comparatively rare, reflecting the deeply unequal way the law was actually applied in practice, despite its officially gender-neutral wording. Yet even under this heavy weight of legal and social control, physical evidence and written records eventually surfaced that forced Korean society to confront uncomfortable truths it had spent decades trying to bury. Much of what we now understand about this era comes from evidence that took decades to fully surface. Government documents related to the Camptown system, once tightly controlled, were gradually declassified and studied by historians beginning in the 1990s and 2000s, revealing the direct extent of state involvement in regulating sex work near military installations. Survivor testimonies became one of the most powerful forms of evidence. Former Camptown workers, many of them elderly by the time they came forward, provided first-hand accounts that directly contradicted official narratives claiming the system operated independently of government oversight. Some of these women eventually pursued legal action against the South Korean government itself, arguing that the state had violated their human rights by facilitating and profiting from the system decades earlier. Historical newspapers and court archives from the mid-20th century, once difficult to access, have since been digitized and studied extensively, revealing the true scale of adultery prosecutions and the disproportionate impact these laws had on women. Academic research using these archives has reshaped how historians understand gender and power in post-war Korea. Cultural artifacts also tell part of the story. Photographs, personal letters, and even popular songs from the era, when studied by historians, reveal a private world that often existed in quiet defiance of the official public morality being enforced by the state and reinforced through media censorship. Banned song lyrics from the 1970s, preserved in government censorship archives, show just how far authorities went to suppress even indirect references to romance or physical affection, with entire albums pulled from shelves over a single suggestive line. Academic researchers have also cross-referenced hospital and public health records from the era, uncovering data on reproductive health, family planning campaigns, and sexually transmitted infection rates that were rarely discussed publicly at the time, but provide historians with a much clearer picture of how these official policies actually affected ordinary people's lives, often quite differently from what state propaganda claimed. One particular piece of evidence, however, proved more controversial than any other, because it directly implicated the government in a scale of involvement that officials had denied for decades. In 2014, a group of over 100 elderly former Camptown workers filed an unprecedented lawsuit against the South Korean government. arguing that the state had not merely tolerated but actively organized, regulated, and profited from the sex work system that had operated near military bases for decades. This was a direct legal challenge to the long-standing official position that the government bore no responsibility for what had happened. In 2018, and again on appeal in 2022, South Korean courts issued a landmark ruling, acknowledging that the government had indeed played a direct role in operating and justifying the system, framing it at the time as necessary for national security and the maintenance of the alliance with the United States. The court ordered compensation for the surviving women, a historic and unprecedented admission of state responsibility. This ruling represented a profound contradiction finally being addressed. The same government had spent decades enforcing strict Confucian morality laws, criminalizing adultery, and publicly upholding an image of national chastity and honor, all while having been directly involved in organizing a large-scale sex work system as a matter of state policy. Historians argue that this contradiction was deliberately hidden from public education and mainstream historical narratives for decades, precisely because it complicated the clean, conservative national image the state wished to project both domestically and internationally. This is why many textbooks in Korea, even today, address this chapter of history only briefly, if at all. The court case brought this hidden contradiction into public view in a way that could no longer be ignored, and it set the stage for the dramatic social movements that would follow. The single event that historians point to as the true turning point for modern Korean attitudes towards sex, consent, and gender is the explosive rise of the Me Too movement, which reached South Korea with full force beginning in early 2018. Sparked initially by a senior prosecutor publicly accusing a colleague of sexual harassment on national television, the movement rapidly expanded to expose powerful figures across politics, entertainment, religion, and academia. What made this moment historically significant was not simply the accusations themselves, but the fact that Korean society, for the first time at this scale, began openly confronting the same contradictions between public morality and private reality that had defined the previous 70 years. Alongside Me Too, a separate but connected movement emerged against illegal spy cam pornography, known locally as molka, which had become a widespread and deeply damaging form of sexual exploitation enabled by hidden cameras in public spaces. Massive public protests, some drawing tens of thousands of participants, demanded stronger legal protections and harsher enforcement against these crimes. Modern historians view this period as the moment when South Korea's sexual culture stopped being defined primarily by state control and inherited Confucian shame, and instead began being actively renegotiated by its own citizens, particularly women and younger generations, through public protest, legal reform, and open digital discourse. This matters today because it directly shaped the legal reforms, dating culture, gender discourse, and media content that define contemporary South Korea, a nation now producing globally influential film, music, and television that openly explore themes once considered unspeakable. By the early 2020s, South Korea had passed stronger legislation against digital sex crimes, established dedicated units within law enforcement to investigate spy cam offenses, and seen a measurable shift in public opinion polls regarding gender equality, consent, and personal autonomy, particularly among people under the age of 40. At the same time, this progress remained deeply contested. Backlash movements emerged, particularly online, with some younger men arguing that reforms had gone too far, leading to ongoing and sometimes heated national debates about gender that continue to shape South Korean politics and culture even now, in 2026. This ongoing tension is, in many ways, the direct modern continuation of the very same contradiction between official values and lived reality that has defined this entire history since 1948, tracing this journey from the rigid Confucian codes of the Joseon dynasty through the painful contradictions of wartime survival and state-regulated camp towns, to the courtroom battles and street protests of the 21st century, reveals something essential about how societies evolve. Ancient customs did not simply vanish, they were reshaped, challenged, and renegotiated across generations. Modern South Korean relationships, dating culture, and gender discourse exist today precisely because earlier generations were forced to confront the gap between official morality and lived reality. Understanding this history offers a valuable lesson applicable well beyond Korea itself, that a society's stated values and its actual practices are often two very different things, and real change tends to come only when that gap becomes impossible to ignore any longer. It also reminds us that historical progress is rarely a straight line. For every legal reform, there was decades of silence beforehand, and for every public reckoning, there were countless individuals who lived and died without ever seeing the acknowledgement or justice they deserved. The women of the camp town system, the couples criminalized under adultery laws, and the generations raised without any real education about their own bodies were all shaped by forces largely outside their control, forces that were only named and confronted by later generations willing to ask uncomfortable questions and demand accountability from their own institutions. History is never just the story of wars and empires. Human relationships and sexual culture have quietly shaped civilizations just as powerfully as any battlefield or political treaty. And when we examine these topics honestly, supported by real historical evidence, we begin to understand just how much society can transform over time, and how much of that transformation is still ongoing today. Thank you so very much for watching this deep dive into a chapter of history that is rarely told with this level of honesty.